Hi, so it's a rainy day here in California in April. Meanwhile, in Singapore, it's the start of one of the hottest months of the calendar. Let's quickly talk about a couple of things. When I was growing up, I had about $100,000 in student loans from law school. I paid that off by the time I was about 30 years old, if I remember correctly. Might have been a little bit later. And at the same time that I was paying off my loans and foregoing, even simple pleasures like a Starbucks coffee or a Starbucks latte, I was reading about all these different privileges and benefits that public safety employees had, and particularly the police and firefighters. And, we all know that military spending in this country is out of control. And we also know that it's really not even sustainable. We know it's not sustainable because it's, the military spending is done through something called appropriations. It's essentially off budget. So we know the military spending is out of control, and we know that for the most part, city budgets are about 50 to 60 and sometimes even higher allocated to public safety, which includes police and firefighters. And when I was growing up, I remember this complaint from public sector unions saying that, the people don't care about us. Nobody cares about us. And I remember just being very upset at hearing that, because clearly when you look at the, financial allocations, that just seems like a false statement. And when you're in your, when you're in your 20s and you're focusing on paying off $100,000 in loans, you don't really want to hear about people who are being mistreated within a separate structure that for the most part treats them in a way that's superior to the rest of the population, the rest of the working population. And, as I've gotten older, you've got a situation where, I've realized that there is some legitimacy to that complaint. And, I'm speaking after the trial of George Floyd, and particularly after President Biden has shifted the date of leaving Afghanistan from May 1st until September 11th of this year. And we can start with that. We know that the leadership doesn't really care, whether it's military or civilian, about the troops that are stationed overseas, because the prior administration, which was heavily or very pro-military, it's not as if those generals suddenly swapped out. It's not as if within the course of a few months, the intelligence changed. At least we would hope not. But certainly if the intelligence changed, it's not as if a few more months is going to dramatically change the situation. And, if you're somebody who's stuck in Afghanistan, a war that's been going on for, I believe, about 20 years now, and you've been told for quite some time that you're going to leave by May 1st. You get to go home to your family, and then suddenly this new president comes in and says, no, actually, you're going to stay there for several more months. And on top of that, we're going to pick a date that is symbolic. And because it's symbolic, we're going to essentially make you subservient to the idea of symbolism rather than efficacy. Because we know it could have been September 1st, it could have been September 20th. The fact that they're picking this date is not only ironic, because of course, after 9/11, the United States invaded the wrong country. It invaded Iraq rather than Afghanistan. It then realized its mistake and then went after, and then essentially invaded Afghanistan and decided to stay there. And Afghanistan, of course, was a place where the United States had funded militias in order to draw in Soviet troops, thereby overextending or helping to overextend the Soviet Union, which was also running on military spending and oil. Now, you have to realize that by picking this date, you've got a bunch of writers or academics that have decided that an extra 10 days is worth symbolism. In other words, the risk of someone's life is worth a symbolism that is false. And if you're some 20-year-old or perhaps even a 40-year-old, depending on how long you've been there, and suddenly you have to be there for many more months than you anticipated, you can only imagine just setting aside just the fact that you don't get to see your family, you get to miss different events, and in fact, you may even end up missing a high school or some other graduation. You put that aside and you can see that even the military has, at least on a lower level, has a legitimate complaint, despite the fact that we're dealing with outsized spending. And so it finally made sense to me when I realized just how out of touch the executive branch is. And on top of that, of course, you've got lawyers, most of whom probably have never been to Afghanistan or the Middle East in any way that's useful, without a caravan, without a private security detail, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you don't speak the language of any country that you visit, it's almost, very difficult to get any sort of meaningful experience from traveling, unless you're a historian or unless you're able to walk freely wherever you go. And just this simple moving of dates is symbolic, but not in the way that the administration intends. It's symbolic in a way that proves that the leadership in this country just doesn't care about troops stationed overseas, that at least on some level, it's just a show. With respect to the police, we talked about Chauvin, the police officer who knelt on the neck of George Floyd for almost 3 minutes, even after he had no pulse. And he was convicted of unintentional homicide, and faces up to 75 years in jail, a maximum of 75 years in jail. The reason I bring that up is because the tactic of a knee that the police officer used, of a knee on someone's neck, is something that many police officers are trained to do. And I know that because when I look at Hollywood movies, or even foreign movies, there are scenes from 10 years ago where the police officers would restrain somebody in the movie or in the television show in exactly the same manner, which tells you that this isn't some isolated incident. This is something that's been part and parcel of either academy training or general training. And I suppose you can marvel at the inhumanity of all of it. But at the same time, when the police officers say that nobody cares about us, that cities don't care about us, then you've got a morale problem, especially if people are following orders, but they're not being trained properly. And so, despite the fact that anyone with two eyes would agree that what the police officer did in George Floyd's case was inhumane, there's this idea that people in low-level positions follow orders. And not only do they follow orders, but they are trained to follow orders. And so on some level, the responsibility trickles upwards. And by blaming Chauvin, rather than also identifying the processes that got us, all of us, to that place, we are in fact making it harder for police officers to feel as if they are part of that community. And this is a monumental task because, even if you suddenly change academy training procedures, you still have police officers that are trained in the old ways who probably are not going to be very enthusiastic about a situation where they have to take time off or personal time or even any kind of time to participate in a training when they've had on-the-job experience. And with Chauvin, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, it's particularly problematic because he was working the same area for 19 years. If there's anybody who knew that area better than Chauvin, I'd like to see it. And because he did the same move a few years prior against somebody else who did not die, you can see that number one, the charge of unintentional homicide was the right one. And number two, that it really does appear that as if he was following a kind of training manual that not just he himself has been taught, but other people have been taught. And so because we have a morale problem, that's why the budget, that's why the mayors, that's why the politicians have such, one of the reasons why they have such imbalanced and, in a sense, financially discriminatory budgeting with respect to public safety. Because there's less morale, a lot of politicians have simply decided not to fix the morale problem or the training problem, but simply to pay people off, just like the mafia would, to keep them silent and employed and in a position where they follow orders. And, you know, loyalty that's based on sort of financial or purely financial motives is not really loyalty at all. And so we're caught in this vicious cycle where police officers are complaining about morale issues and we pay them more. We tilt the pension funds in a way that in many cases runs the risk of bankrupting entire cities. And we still haven't fixed the morale problem. And it's because we're trying to fix it from a financial angle rather than trying to make any sort of fundamental changes. And if you're a leadership, if you're a lieutenant or a sergeant, you know, you probably don't mind that approach. But if you're somebody who's been working the same job in the same poor neighborhood for 19 years, and you've got people second guessing you, when you've been trained to do something a certain way, either by, you know, your friends, by colleagues, or somebody else, you know, it's a situation where there are no winners. The city loses. The people lose. And I find it horrendous that I have to be put in a position where I'm defending, in a sense, someone like Chauvin. In my 20s, I would have simply said, if you don't like the job, go to college. You know, try to get a better job. Well, guess what? Chauvin did go to college. He has a bachelor's degree. Not from any institution that you and I would know about, but he still did what a lot of people do when they're trying to get out of a hole, which is to go to college and graduate. And you have to really wonder why someone like me, who's a minority, who was called for police reform for quite some time, and it was said that you can't have police reform until you reform the lawyers and the judges as well, why I have to be put in a position where I'm defending a lowly police officer who, in a sense, well, I guess we can say who committed a homicide, even if it was unintentional. The reason I'm in this position is because we've all failed. And that lack of morale, whether it's in public safety or overseas, is in a sense making it harder to maintain social cohesion. So we're having to pay people off. You know, the stimulus package, again, is also evidence that our economic programs are not working. So that results in more payoffs, which is what we call, as a euphemism, stimulus payments, and so on and so forth. But really, we've sort of lost our way. And the failure to improve the morale of not just public safety workers, but everybody, has caused the government to function in a way that's similar to the mafia, where you're paying people off and in a sense you're extorting money from them in order to make your empire work. That's not sustainable. And I just wish people would sort of try to understand how to fix these problems, you know, in a way that was sustainable, which requires probably sacrifices. All those union contracts, the MOUs and the CBAs have to be revised. They're not going to be revised if, you know, people in those jobs don't have, you know, some sort of tie to the community, some sort of, you know, loyalty. That's a two-way street. And this is a self-defeating cycle. It's a vicious cycle because people like me will look at this and look at these unfair terms, these unsustainable terms in the union contracts, and then basically and truthfully say that the public is being ripped off. But when I was in my 20s, I thought it was just greed. Now that I'm in my, you know, I'm in my early 40s, I realize it's simply something that we're doing to compensate for the fact that we can't fix the morale issue, and we can't really fix any fundamental issue in this country. And as a result, we've resorted to, you know, sort of government by mafia. And that makes all of us weak. That makes all of us insecure.